Whispers by Dean Koontz, a very important book in the Koontz canon. So, Dean Koontz, if you know me, you may know that I have perhaps an unusual relationship with Dean Koontz. He holds the unique distinction of having written both one of my most loved and most hated books. His novel, Intensity, is one of my favorite books of all time. Seriously, this book is in my top 10 ever. I love this book so much. It means more to me than you would probably think that any mainstream thriller novel possibly could. But I absolutely cherish this book, Intensity. I just adore this book. Really, it has a place near and dear to my heart. But conversely, Dean Koontz's novel Lightning is one of the most roundly awful books that I have ever attempted to read. I say attempted because I could not even get through it because of how terrible it was. So Dean and I have quite the history, I guess you might say. But he will probably always have a little bit of goodwill from me simply because of how much I do cherish his book Intensity. But this book, Whispers, like I said, is a very important book in Koontz's overall body of work because it is pretty much the book that made him. It was the first bestseller, I believe, that he had ever had, and it pretty much served to cement the Koontz brand. But beyond that, it also effectively inaugurated the golden age of Koontz's career. As I have said before, and as I will say again here now, Dean Koontz's career can be effectively divided into three stages. The early years, which is from the mid to late 1960s to 1980. That was when Koontz was just starting out. He was churning out books at the rate of bowel movements, pretty much, just trying to get a foothold in the industry. Most of those old books are long out of print because they were pretty much just schlock that he was um, churning out, just trying to get traction. From the early years, however, the closest thing I think that he ever had to like a serious hit would be this book, Night Chills. This is very representative, for good or ill, of early years Dean Koontz. This, like I said, is pretty much the closest I think he ever came to having a serious hit in those early years from the mid to late 1960s to 1980. But with the publication of this book, Whispers, in 1980, the golden age of Dean Koontz's career dawned. And the golden age lasted from 1980 to 1995 with the publication of Intensity, his magnum opus, the true masterwork of Dean Koontz's career, which capped the golden age and effectively ended it. But from the year 1980 to 1995, Dean Koontz put out some of his best work, the majority of his best work. Books such as Phantoms, The Servants of Twilight, The Door to December, and of course Intensity. All bangers, all bangers. And you know, I'm not going to say that all of those books that he put out in that period were on the level of the brothers Karamazov, perhaps, although I will defend Intensity as actually having some literary value to it. I think that that book is more than a mere thriller novel, or at least so it is to me. But the books, by and large, that he put out in this golden age period were, like I said, bangers. They were just top of the line thriller novels, just some of the best that you could hope to read in that era, I think. And then from 1995 to present, Dean Koontz's career has been in what I refer to as the Catholic era, because Dean Koontz is a very devout Catholic, very spiritual, very religious man, and that has become much more apparent in his recent output, again, for good or ill. And so now the books that he writes are very, very close, much of the time, many times, I should say, to like kind of Christian fiction, like books such as The Taking and Innocence. Those books are like pretty much Christian fiction, or as close as you can get to Christian fiction without officially being there. And that's not to throw any shade towards those books, but the nature of his output now is definitely distinct from the nature of his output in the Golden Age, and very, very distinct from his output in the early years. But with all that said, Whispers was the turning point. It was, like I said, the book which inaugurated the Koontzian Golden Age. And it is very representative of his output kind of in that era. And I think that's mostly a good thing, because this book slaps. It really does. That's not to say it's flawless or that it's, world class literature, but for what it is, this book goes, and it goes hard. And as per usual, I'm going to give you the lowdown on it. So, what is the story of Whispers? Well, Whispers tells the story of Hillary Thomas. She is a young screenwriter living in California, because virtually all of Dean Koontz's books take place in California. Much like the overwhelming majority of Stephen King's books take place in Maine, Dean Koontz's body of work takes place largely in California. So Hillary Thomas is a young screenwriter living in California, working in the movie industry, obviously writing scripts. One day she is attacked by a homicidal maniac named Bruno Fry, and she calls the police, where she meets super cop Tony Clemenza, who she quickly develops a relationship with. And they don't really believe her, because Bruno Fry ran off, and there really isn't that much evidence that she was really attacked. So they're like, I think you're faking it. This was written before the Me Too era, I should say, because the cops are incredibly dismissive of her claims to nearly being raped and murdered, which, again, would not fly now. But anyway, so eventually Bruno Fry, the maniac, comes back, tries to kill her again, but she gets the upper hand on him and stabs him to death. So he's out of the picture, and it seems like everything is going to be good. She's hitting it off with super cop Tony. They're totally into each other. The future looks rosy. But then Bruno Fry, the killer, comes back seemingly from beyond the grave. And now the kind of mystery of the book, and it is sort of a mystery novel as well as being a thriller, consists of how can this be? How can a man who they know that she killed seemingly return from the dead to try to kill her again? And so the rest of the plot is them trying to contend with the threat of this madman and kind of get to the bottom of what's happening. Is there supernatural? Is there supernatural things afoot, or is there a logical explanation? And so that's kind of the plot. I don't normally in these reviews, I don't mind spoiling a book, because it kind of aids in my critique of it. But with this being a thriller novel, the plot is the main draw here. So I'm going to try my best to avoid, revealing the twists and turns and spoiling it. So that's kind of what I'll say for the plot. So yeah, that is what Whispers is about. So now that we know what the main gist of the story is, let's talk about the technical qualities of the story. So the writing in Whispers is pretty good, honestly. Dean Koontz is a good writer in a prose sense. That has always been Dean Koontz's strength. And I think he actually bolstered that strength as his career wore on, because different writers have different strengths and different weaknesses, and the actual quality of the writing has always been Dean Koontz's biggest strength in my book, anyway. Conversely, like Stephen King, His books are very rich in character, but the prose is often hokey and bad. Kind of the opposite is true with Dean Koontz. The writing is usually pretty good, and especially in intensity. Again, I will defend this book as uh, not only an excellent thriller novel, but an incredibly well written thriller novel, too. Like, there is some seriously good writing in this book. But yeah, the writing uh, that Dean Koontz does has generally been his uh, main strength, and I think that's pretty evident in this. I'm not saying that it's going to be on the level of Proust or something like that, but it's pretty well done. Honestly, it's economical, but it does have the occasional flourish that can kind of jump out at you. So really, I don't have a lot to complain about with the writing. I don't think it's the strongest he ever did. Again, I think Intensity is a remarkably well written thriller novel, but it's not bad. So writing's fine. Now let's talk about the characters because the characters, if the writing is Dean Koontz's main strength, the characters are almost always his main weakness because Dean Koontz cannot write characters very well. The characters in Whispers are stock. If you've read a Dean Koontz book in your life, chances are that you will be familiar with the characters in this book, even if you have not read this specific book, because there are prime stock Dean Koontz characters. That's kind of the thing about Dean Koontz is that he basically just reuses the same archetypes over and over and over again in his books. You have like the perfect woman and the perfect man. His characters are so perfect, and that's partly why his novel Lightning was so just atrocious, or so I found it to be. Whispers is not quite that bad. Actually, it's nowhere near that bad. But you will recognize the archetypes if you've read a Dean Koontz book, probably because this is kind of, I guess, where things began in that regard. So Hillary Thomas is our heroine. She is basically just the perfect woman. She's like the platonic ideal of the perfect woman. She is a just an absolute bombshell, honey, with a rocking bod and a pretty face. But she's also brilliant. She's a successful screenwriter. Um, she's got a mind to match the body. And her personality, she's sweet and loving and warm-hearted. You know, just everything you would want in a woman, right? Just the absolute perfect woman. She has a tragic backstory because that's how Dean Koontz do. That is how Dean Koontz do in his books. So that you have these perfect women, oftentimes with tragic backstories of abuse and trauma, and such is the case with Whispers. Hillary Thomas's backstory is that her parents were alcoholics and she was beaten and abused as a child. Very Dickensian, because of course Dean Koontz worships at the altar of Charles Dickens, and that is quite apparent in this book, although it becomes much more apparent in his later books. But her character is very, like I said, stock, but I guess it works. It's not as offensively bad as it was in Lightning, but it's not the most rounded thing. And again, the more Dean Koontz books you read, the more you'll see the exact same thing. And also, we have Tony Clemenza, our main hero and love interest of Hillary. He is, once again, just pure Koontz stock character. He is the tough but gentle super cop who also has a chiseled physique but a sharp mind as well, and also has a nice personality. Again, just the perfect man, everything you'd want in a man, right? He can be the knight in shining armor, but he's also, like I said, gentle and tender. He's a good listener, and he's also great in bed. I may touch on that in a minute. So yeah, the characters in this, again, it's just pure Koontz stock. Hillary has the tragic backstory of abuse. Tony has the kind of Horatio Alger backstory of rags to riches, poor urchin to super cop. And you know, it's not great, but you know, it works in this case because it's not as bad as it would later get. Again, Lightning has some of the most egregious characterization I've ever attempted to read in any book. But this book is not that book, and it gets it over the line. I'll say the characters aren't great, but they're not the worst that Dean Koontz would ever write. In fact, in the afterword to this, because this edition came with an afterword where Dean reflected on the book and what it did for his career. He mentions that he regrets the Freudianism that's infused into the story, and that is another thing that you'll notice is different between this book and later books that he would write, is that Dean Koontz is not a fan now, at least, of Freudian psychology, the kind of woe is me, mommy didn't love me enough type of characterization, which is why in his later books like Intensity, the villains became much more elemental. They evil became not so much an effect as it became kind of just a cause of itself. It's just kind of a freely chosen thing that the villains do. Just, it's a free will, right? And that's definitely kind of like I said, a distinction to be made here between then Koontz and now Koontz. So take that how you will. Now let's talk about the story of Whispers, because Whispers is very, like I said, representative of Dean Koontz's output from that era. And it is very distinct from his output now. Like the kind of books that he writes now are not like this book at all. This book, it's not as incredibly exploitative as Night Chills was. This is one of the most, this is like pure exploitation literature. Just rape out the ass, sexual violence on damn near every page, extreme violence, and extreme violence directed against children, which would never happen in a Dean Koontz book now. But Whispers is coming off of that, but it's also him kind of toning things down a little bit. But you can still feel the exploitation kind of bursting at the seams a little bit, kind of rubbing up against the edges. The story of this book is, like I said, distinct from his later output because he was doing anything he could to get traction, and that does not exclude titillation. So if you don't know, Dean Koontz also wrote some porn, I think, like literal erotica, in his career. I think he would deny that now. In fact, I think he has denied writing porn, but I'm pretty sure he wrote some serious porno books back in the day, trying to make ends meet. And you can feel that in this book because, good Lord, the sex scenes in this book are insanely explicit. And again, the Dean Koontz's output now is much more squeaky in that regard. He does not go in for the explicit content like he used to back in the day. But damn, the sex in this book is very, very graphic, and it kind of goes on and on and on. Like some of these sex scenes in this book cover like a page or two or three. It just goes on and on. Again, very in depth in terms of the carnal, but also the violence is much more explicit. Even though it's nowhere near the level of early years Koontz, like in Night Chills. But it's still much more graphic in terms of the violence than his later books, because as his career wore on and as his success grew, Dean Koontz learned the lesson that you don't always have to show the violence. You can just infer the violence, imply it. But this wasn't quite there yet. There's a lot of hardcore violence in this book. Much gnarlier than his later output would be, although still not quite as gnarly as some of the books that preceded this. But this is still Dean Koontz trying to do anything to attract readers, which is pulling out all the stops. So there's that. But the plotting of the story is actually pretty good. And this is a kind of a long book, or at least it is in this a mass market paperback edition. It's over 500 pages long, but it never felt too long, actually, and it moved pretty well. I think it moved pretty quick. Uh, Enough to keep you riveted. In fact, it is a page turner. That's what Dean Koontz does best, or at least what he did best, was write fast-paced page turners. And this evinces that marvelously. I was turning the pages at times in this book feverishly because it was that gripping. But the biggest weakness in this book, the major flaw in Whispers, has to do with the way that the book ends. And the book ends very, very abruptly. It cuts off just sharply. And, I suppose I can understand doing that in a thriller novel, but still, it's kind of jarring. Like, with most stories, you have the inciting incidents, the rising action, the climax, and then you have falling action and ending. That's kind of how most stories go. This book ends right with the climax. Like, you have the inciting incident, rising action, climax, and then it just ends like right there. And it ends too freaking fast because there is not enough wrap up time in this book. It feels like there are some ends that are loose whenever this wraps up that are not adequately addressed. In fact, I was kind of looking to see if some pages were missing at the end of this, because I was like, there's no way that it ends that abruptly. But it did. It really just cuts off right after the climax happens. And yeah, it did not need to do that. It needed to have a little bit more falling action than it did, or actually just needed to have falling action at all, because it doesn't. It's the climax, and then it just drops off a cliff into the ending. So yeah, there is a weakness with this book in terms of its plotting, and that is the denouement of it. But overall, shortcomings aside, and it does have shortcomings, I have to say I freaking loved Whispers. It is the book, as I said, which made Dean Koontz, and it's the book that inaugurated his golden age. And it kind of demonstrates why, because it is just kind of a blast to read. So taking all that into account, I'm going to give Whispers a B. It's not. I would not say that this is among Dean Koontz's best work, but it is approaching that. It is coming towards the best work that he ever put out, and it is hella fun to read. So yeah, the characters are stiff and stock, but in the plotting, it needed more in the way of resolution than it gave us. But overall, it's fun. It is a great thriller novel, and it shows why Dean Koontz, became one of the premier writers of thrillers in America. I think it's on full display when reading this. It's, as I said, very representative of his output from that era, and very distinct from his output now. But, for what it is, this book slaps. It does. I had a blast reading it. And it reminds me why I keep coming back to Koontz, even if I have to go back to his earlier work, because some of that earlier work was damn fine. It really was. And I think it still largely holds up. So, yeah, I'm going to give Whispers a B. It's a banger of a thriller novel. But not the best he ever put out. But yeah, Whispers by Dean Koontz. Have you read Whispers? If you have, let me know down in the comments what you thought about it, whether you have agreed or disagreed with anything I've said here today. If you haven't read Whispers, I could recommend this. I mean, hell yeah, it's a fun, fast-paced, high-octane type read. Again, it may not be the most literary thing, but if you just want some fun, you want to get lost in a really engaging and fast-paced story, You can do a whole lot worse than this. So yeah, I could recommend this if you ever see this in a bookstore and you need something to read, like on a trip or something. And this will probably do you well. And as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to hit that like button and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And until next time, peace.